Suppose you know that f of g of x is the square root of 2 to the x. What are your functions f and g? Well, on this side, if I give you a value of x, what's the first thing you're going to do? Well, you're going to do 2 to the x. If I say, okay, x is equal to 2, what are you going to do? You're going to do 2 to the second, right? That's going to be 4, and then you're going to take the square root of it. Now, what's the first thing that happens to x in the expression f of g of x? If I give you f of x, if I give you a value of x, say, okay, x is 2. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to plug that into g to get that value, and then you're going to apply f. Okay, so the first thing that happens is you do 2 to the x, and the first thing that happens is you do g to the x, or g of x, so g of x is 2 to the x. First thing that happens to x. It's the first thing you do, and we call it the inner function because it's inside of this parentheses, okay? And then what's f of x? What do you have to do to the 2 to the x to make it into square root of 2 to the x? Well, you take the square root. So f of x is square root of x, and you can verify then that f of g of x will be the square root of g of x, which is the square root of 2 to the x. We verify that that is the function. Now you want to do all that when you see these, and you're going to see them there in the homework. So there we have it. You identify the inner function, that's g of x, the first thing that you do when you're given x. Then you figure out what your other function is. You figure out what you have to do to that result to get this, and that's your f of x function. So, for example, if you have f of g of x equals 1 divided by the square root of x, okay, what's your inner function? What's the first thing that happens to x? Well, the first thing that happens is you do the square root, so that's what your g of x function is, square root of x. What's the next thing? Well, you do the reciprocal of that. Well, what's your reciprocal function? Well, that's f of x equals 1 over x. So you should verify that if this is your f of x function and this is your g of x function, well, f of g of x, which is what we're looking for, f of g of x is going to be the square root of g of x. I'm sorry, it's going to be 1 over g of x, sorry. And if g of x is the square root of x, then you have 1 over the square root of x, and that's what you want to have. Okay. Book gives you plenty of explanations. You can find composites all over the internet. Videos, explanations. Unfortunately, I don't think they sell brain implants, so you're going to have to do some work here. But do it, and you'll be able to, you will understand this.